She was just a junior analyst, until one hidden clause exposed the truth behind a billion-dollar lie. Her voice was quiet, but it brought down a corporate empire built on deception. Welcome to Tales by Ezra. Let's uncover what really happened. The city exhaled a bruised twilight. The sky between the towering glass structures the color of old denim. Alara Mensa watched it from the 47th floor, her reflection a ghost against the sprawling metropolis. The lights below were beginning to prick the darkness, a million tiny ambitions igniting, each one oblivious to the weight pressing down on her own shoulders. She was an analyst, a junior one, at Sterling and Thorne Global, a name that resonated with power and the cold, clean scent of money. Her cubicle was small, her view borrowed, her presence, she often felt, tolerated rather than truly valued. She'd learned early to navigate the subtle currents of the office, the unspoken hierarchies, the coded language of polite dismissal. Tonight, the weight was a document, specifically Annex C, Subclause 7.2 of the Horizon Initiative proposal. It was a behemoth of a project, lauded by the CEO, Alastair Sterling, as the company's bold leap into a sustainable future. But Subclause 7.2, nestled deep within pages of dense legalese, felt less like sustainability and more like a carefully laid snare. It spoke of land acquisition in a remote, ecologically fragile delta, using methodologies that skirted ethical boundaries so closely they might as well have been dancing on them. Alara had stumbled upon it by accident, a misdirected file, a late night fueled by lukewarm coffee and the gnawing sense that something was amiss. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights since, cross-referencing, digging, the knot in her stomach tightening with each discovery. Her small apartment, usually a sanctuary, now felt like a war room, papers spread across the worn rug, her laptop screen glowing with maps and redacted reports. Grief, a constant companion since her grandmother's passing last spring. The woman who had raised her, whose belief in Alara was the bedrock of her quiet tenacity, now had a new, sharper edge. Her grandmother had taught her that silence in the face of injustice was a betrayal of one's own soul. Sterling and Thorne, with its gleaming facade and pronouncements of corporate responsibility, was beginning to look like a gilded cage built on a foundation of convenient omissions. The project was Sterling's legacy, his magnum opus before a rumored retirement. It was to question the man himself, a man whose smile could charm birds from trees and whose displeasure could wither careers overnight. Alara adjusted the collar of her simple, dark dress, a hand-me-down her grandmother had altered for her first interview. She felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes, the sting of unshed tears, but pushed it down. This wasn't the time for emotion. This was the time for facts, for courage, however small and trembling. She had a meeting with her direct supervisor, Ms. Albright, in the morning, a preliminary presentation of her concerns. Albright was a woman carved from ambition and tailored suits, her empathy seemingly reserved for profit margins. Alara expected to be dismissed, perhaps even subtly threatened. But she had to try. The alternative, the silence, was a heavier burden than any professional repercussion. She looked back at the city, at the endless, indifferent lights. Somewhere down there, in that fragile delta, life went on, unaware of the ink drying on a contract that could irrevocably alter its future. And here, on the 47th floor, a junior analyst with too much conscience and not enough clout was about to whisper a warning into the roaring wind of corporate progress. The thought was terrifying, but the thought of doing nothing was infinitely worse. She picked up her worn briefcase, the weight of Annex C feeling like lead within it, and walked towards the elevator, her reflection dissolving into the encroaching night. The fluorescent lights of Ms. Albright's office hummed with an aggressive cheerfulness that Alara found grating. The room was minimalist, stark white and chrome, a reflection of its occupant. Ms. Albright, perched behind a glass desk that seemed to float, regarded Alara with an expression that hovered somewhere between impatience and mild curiosity. Her silver blonde hair was pulled back in a severe chignon, not a strand out of place. "Ms. Mensah," she began, her voice crisp, "you mentioned some irregularities in the Horizon Initiative documentation. I trust this won't take long. Mr. Sterling is expecting a final brief from me by noon." Alara's hands, clasped in her lap, felt clammy. She'd rehearsed this a dozen times, but the reality of Albright's cool, appraising stare was unnerving. "Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Albright. It pertains to Annex C, specifically Subclause 7.2, regarding the land acquisition protocols in the Saramonga Delta." She laid out a neatly printed summary, her own annotations highlighted in pale yellow. Albright picked it up, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the paper. She scanned it, her expression unchanging. Alara continued, her voice low but steady. "The clause outlines a community resettlement program that, upon closer examination of the socioeconomic reports for the region, appears to significantly undervalue existing land rights and traditional livelihoods. Furthermore, the environmental impact assessment seems to omit crucial data regarding protected wetland areas directly affected by the proposed development." She paused, taking a shallow breath. "Essentially, Ms. Albright, the current wording could be interpreted as predatory, and the potential for ecological damage is, I believe, understated." Albright finished reading, her lips pursed. She placed the summary on her desk with a deliberate slowness. "Ms. Mensah," she said, her tone now edged with a steely disapproval, "Sterling and Thorne has a robust legal department, and our environmental consultants are world-renowned. Are you suggesting they've all overlooked something that a junior analyst, barely 6 months with the company, has managed to unearth?" The condescension was palpable. Alara felt a flush creep up her neck, but she held Albright's gaze. "I'm suggesting, Ms. Albright, that the data I've found warrants a second look. The implications, both for the local communities and for the company's reputation, could be severe if these issues are not addressed." Albright leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking softly. "Reputation is a matter of perception, Ms. Mensah, and sometimes progress requires difficult choices. The Horizon Initiative is projected to generate unprecedented returns, and its socioeconomic benefits for the broader region are undeniable." She gestured vaguely. "A few displaced villages, some manageable environmental adjustments. These are often the unfortunate but necessary byproducts of large-scale development." Alara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Manageable adjustments?" she echoed, her voice barely a whisper. "The reports I've reviewed suggest the potential for irreversible damage to a unique ecosystem and the displacement of thousands without adequate compensation or alternative livelihoods." Albright's smile was thin, almost reptilian. "You have a very idealistic view of corporate responsibility, Ms. Mensah. Perhaps a little naive. Sterling and Thorne operates within the legal frameworks of all its host nations. We are not an NGO." She picked up the summary again, but this time she didn't look at it. "I appreciate your diligence. However, I believe your concerns are, perhaps, disproportionate to the reality of the situation. The project is on a tight schedule. Mr. Sterling is personally invested. I would advise you to focus on your assigned tasks and leave these broader strategic concerns to those with more experience." The dismissal was clear. Alara's heart sank, but a stubborn spark of defiance remained. "With all due respect, Ms. Albright, my assigned task, as an analyst, is to assess risk. And this," she tapped her own copy of the summary, "represents a significant risk." Albright's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my judgment, Ms. Mensah?" "I am presenting factual discrepancies that I believe require further investigation," Alara stated, her voice firmer now. There was a long, tense silence. Albright's gaze was like chips of ice. Finally, she sighed, a sound of manufactured weariness. "Very well. Leave your documents. I will consider them, but I make no promises." And Ms. Mensah, her voice dropped a silken thread. "Discretion is paramount at Sterling and Thorne. Unsubstantiated claims can have unfortunate consequences for one's career trajectory." Alara nodded slowly. "I understand." She rose, her legs feeling a little unsteady. "Thank you for your time." She walked out of the office, the hum of the fluorescent lights seeming to mock her. She hadn't been entirely shut down, but the warning was unmistakable. She had stirred a hornet's nest, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Ms. Albright was not her only adversary. The polished corridors of Sterling and Thorne suddenly felt colder, more menacing. The days that followed Ms. Albright's dismissal were filled with a suffocating tension. Alara tried to focus on her regular assignments, market analyses, competitor reports, the usual drudgery, but Annex C loomed large in her mind, a ticking clock. She received no follow-up from Albright, no indication that her concerns were being taken seriously. Instead, she noticed subtle shifts in her work environment. Emails that went unanswered for longer than usual. Colleagues who suddenly became too busy for a quick chat by the coffee machine. The unnerving sensation of being watched, of her every keystroke being monitored. She wasn't paranoid. She was observant. She knew the corporate playbook. Isolate, intimidate, discredit. She spent her evenings poring over the Saramonga Delta data again, searching for an irrefutable piece of evidence, a smoking gun that even Albright couldn't ignore. She found herself drawn to the human element, the faded photographs of village life she'd found in obscure anthropological archives, the testimonies of local activists speaking of ancestral lands and sacred groves. These weren't just data points. They were lives, communities teetering on the brink of erasure. One afternoon, while working late, she encountered Arthur Davies from the Sustainability Department. Davies was an older man, nearing retirement, with kind eyes and a perpetually weary slump to his shoulders. He was an anachronism at Sterling and Thorne, a man who genuinely seemed to care about the sustainability in his department's title, rather than just the optics. He'd always had a polite, encouraging word for Alara in the past. He found her staring intently at a satellite image of the Delta, a deep frown creasing her brow. "Burning the midnight oil, Ms. Mensah?" he asked, his voice gentle. Alara started, quickly minimizing the window. "Mr. Davies, just finishing up some research." Davies glanced at her screen for a fraction of a second before she closed it, but his eyes held a flicker of understanding. "The Saramonga Delta, isn't it? Fascinating region. Ecologically vital." Alara hesitated, then, on an impulse she couldn't quite explain, decided to trust him, at least a little. "It is," she said, "and it seems to be at the heart of the Horizon Initiative's more problematic aspects." Davies sighed a long, tired sound. He leaned against the frame of her cubicle. "Ah, yes. Annex C." Alara's eyes widened. "You know about it? Let's just say," Davies said, his voice low, "that some concerns have been noted, and subsequently filed away. Sterling and Thorne has a remarkable capacity for selective hearing when profits are loud enough. But the potential damage," Alara began, "is considerable," Davies finished for her. "To the environment, to the people, and ultimately to the company, though they don't see it that way yet. They see short-term gain, legacy projects. The long view is often obscured by the glare of quarterly reports." He paused, looking at her intently. "You've raised these concerns, haven't you?" Alara nodded. "With Ms. Albright. And I imagine it went as well as pouring water on a duck's back," Davies said with a wry, humorless smile. "She advised discretion," Alara admitted. "She would," Davies said, nodding slowly. "Alistair Sterling doesn't appreciate obstacles, and Ms. Albright is a master at clearing his path." He looked around the empty office, then lowered his voice further. "Be careful, Ms. Mensah. You're treading on dangerous ground. This project is Sterling's baby. He won't let anything or anyone jeopardize it." "What can I do?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. "They won't listen to me." Davies considered her for a moment. "Perhaps not. But data, irrefutable data, presented in the right way, at the right time, that can be harder to ignore, especially if it threatens the one thing they value more than profit." "Which is?" "Their image," Davies said. "The illusion of corporate responsibility. If the truth about the Saramonga Delta were to become public knowledge, especially with verifiable evidence." He didn't finish the sentence, but Alara understood. He pushed himself off the cubicle wall. "I have some old files," he said, his voice casual again. "Archived environmental surveys of the Delta region. Pre-Sterling and Thorn interest. Perhaps they might contain something illuminating. I'll leave them on the share drive in the obsolete projects folder. Under Project Nightingale." He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, then walked away, his weary slump seeming a little less pronounced. Alara sat there for a long moment, her heart pounding. An ally. An unexpected, quiet ally. She opened her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard, navigating to the obsolete projects folder. Project Nightingale. It was a lifeline. Project Nightingale was a treasure trove. The archived files Davies had pointed her to were exhaustive, detailed ecological surveys, hydrological studies, even transcripts of interviews with indigenous community leaders from years past, all painting a picture of the Saramonga Delta that was far richer and more fragile than Sterling and Thorne's glossy proposal acknowledged. The most damning piece of evidence was a series of geological reports commissioned by a smaller, now-defunct, exploration company. These reports, which Sterling and Thorne had clearly either buried or ignored, indicated a high probability of seismic instability in the precise area designated for the initiative's primary infrastructure. The risk of catastrophic failure, particularly if combined with the proposed deep earth drilling, was not just significant. It was almost certain within a decade. The manageable environmental adjustments Albright had spoken of would be a cataclysm. Alara worked through the night, cross-referencing the Nightingale files with the Horizon Initiative documents, her earlier concerns now solidifying into a cold, hard certainty. This wasn't just predatory land acquisition or ecological carelessness. It was willful negligence on a scale that bordered on criminal. The next morning, she requested another meeting with Ms. Albright, this time via a formal email, attaching a concise summary of the new findings from Project Nightingale, specifically highlighting the seismic risk. She copied Arthur Davies on the email, a small act of solidarity, and a signal that she was not entirely alone. The response was swift. Albright's assistant called within the hour, summoning Alara not to Albright's office, but to the CEO's boardroom on the penthouse floor. The lion's den. Alara's stomach churned, but she straightened her shoulders, gathered her files, and took the elevator up. The boardroom was opulent, a vast expanse of polished mahogany and panoramic city views. Alastair Sterling sat at the head of the long table, flanked by Ms. Albright and two stony-faced men Alara recognized as the company's chief legal counsel and head of security. Sterling, a man whose public image was one of avuncular charm and visionary leadership, regarded Alara with an expression that was anything but charming. His smile, usually so readily deployed for cameras, was absent. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, were cold. "Ms. Mensah," Sterling began, his voice smooth, almost gentle, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Ms. Albright has shared your persistent concerns regarding the Horizon Initiative. And now, these rather dramatic claims about seismic instability." He gestured towards the printout of her summary lying on the table before him. "Frankly, I find them a little fanciful." Alara stood her ground, her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Sterling, the data is from independent geological surveys conducted prior to Sterling and Thorne's involvement. They are extensively documented in the Project Nightingale archive, which I believe was made available to the Horizon Initiative planning team." Albright shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. The legal counsel cleared his throat. "Ms. Mensah, those reports are outdated, potentially unreliable. Our own due diligence, conducted by top-tier geological consultants, found no such prohibitive risks." "With respect, sir," Alara countered, "the consultants Sterling and Thorne hired were given a specific brief, focusing on resource viability, not long-term geohazard assessment. The Nightingale reports, however, were specifically commissioned to assess environmental and geological stability for a much smaller, less invasive project. Their findings are clear and alarming." Sterling steepled his fingers, his gaze unwavering. "And you, a junior analyst, believe you have a more accurate assessment than our entire team of experts, our legal department, and indeed myself? I believe the data speaks for itself, Sir, Alara said. And the data suggests a catastrophic risk that is being ignored. Not just to the environment and the local communities, but to the company's investment, its shareholders, and its reputation, should this project proceed as planned and fail as these reports predict. There was a beat of silence. Then Sterling's lips curved into what might have been mistaken for a smile, but his eyes remained glacial. Ms. Mensah, you have a commendable zeal, but perhaps your talents are being misapplied. Sterling and Thorne values team players, individuals who understand the bigger picture, who trust the established processes and the expertise of their superiors. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. This kind of alarmist behavior, especially based on questionable, outdated information, can be very damaging, not just to the project, but to the careers of those who engage in it. The threat was no longer veiled. Alara felt a chill despite the warmth of the sun streaming through the panoramic windows. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I understand the implications, but my conscience and the evidence I've uncovered do not allow me to remain silent. This isn't about questioning expertise. It's about presenting critical information that appears to have been overlooked or suppressed. It was then that Arthur Davies spoke, his voice unexpectedly strong in the charged atmosphere. He hadn't been invited to the meeting, but he stood now in the doorway, having clearly followed Alara up. Alistair, Davies said, addressing the CO by his first name, a familiarity that made Albright visibly flinch. The Nightingale files are not questionable. I personally archived them years ago. They are thorough, professional, and their conclusions regarding seismic risk in that specific sector of the Delta were, and remain, deeply concerning. I flagged them at the initial planning stages of Horizon. Sterling's head snapped towards Davies, his eyes narrowing. Arthur, this is an internal management discussion, and I am part of this company's management. Alistair, at least for a few more months, Davies said calmly. And part of my role, as I understand it, is to ensure our initiatives are genuinely sustainable, not just performatively so. Ms. Mensah has raised legitimate, evidence-based concerns. To dismiss them out of hand would be imprudent. Sterling's jaw tightened. The carefully constructed facade of control was beginning to crack. He looked from Alara to Davies, his gaze sharp with displeasure. This meeting is over, he said abruptly. Ms. Mensah, you will return to your duties. Mr. Davies, I'd like a word with you in my office. Privately, Alara and Davies exchanged a brief, almost imperceptible glance. She had an ally, a visible one now, but she also knew that they had both just painted targets on their backs. The battle was far from over. It had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. The aftermath of the boardroom confrontation was a chilling silence. Alara was ostentatiously ignored. Her access to certain project files was suddenly restricted, citing updated security protocols. Colleagues who had once offered a friendly nod now averted their gaze. Arthur Davies, she heard through the office grapevine, had been placed on administrative leave pending a review of his recent performance. It was a clear message. Dissent would not be tolerated. But Alara was not deterred. Davies had, before his abrupt departure, managed to slip her a flash drive. Contingency, he'd whispered, his eyes sad but resolute. Everything you need, and more. Use it wisely. The drive contained not only the full Nightingale archive, but also a series underscore of internal memos and emails that Davies had meticulously saved over the years. They painted a damning picture. Sterling and a small inner circle, including Albright, had been aware of the seismic risks from the Saramonga Delta project from very early on. They had actively chosen to suppress the information, to commission new, more favorable reports, and to push the project forward regardless, driven by the promise of massive profits and Sterling's desire for a legacy-defining achievement. It was worse than negligence. It was a calculated deception. Alara knew she couldn't fight this battle from within the company any longer. Sterling controlled the narrative, the resources, the power. She needed to take the information outside, but to whom? The regulatory bodies were often slow, susceptible to corporate influence. The media? That was a dangerous game, one that could easily backfire, branding her as a disgruntled employee with an axe to grind. She spent her evenings in her small apartment, the city lights a cold, indifferent backdrop, strategizing, weighing her options. The weight of the secret, the knowledge of the impending disaster, was immense. She thought of the people in the Saramonga Delta, their lives unknowingly at risk. She thought of her grandmother's unwavering belief in doing what was right, no matter the cost. One name kept coming back to her, Ismene Vance. Vance was a highly respected, fiercely independent investigative journalist, known for her exposés on corporate malfeasance and environmental crimes. She was tenacious, incorruptible, and had a reputation for protecting her sources. Reaching out to her was a huge risk. If Sterling found out, Alara's career wouldn't just be over. She could face legal repercussions, accusations of corporate espionage. But the alternative, allowing the Horizon Initiative to proceed, knowing what she knew, was unthinkable. After another sleepless night, she made her decision. She used an encrypted email service from a public library computer, sending a carefully worded message to Vance, outlining the situation in broad strokes, hinting at the explosive nature of the evidence she possessed. She didn't use her name, only a pseudonym, Nightingale. Days passed with no response. Alara's anxiety grew. Had Vance dismissed her message as a crank? Was she under surveillance? The office felt like a pressure cooker, every glance, every hushed conversation, a potential threat. Then, one evening, as she was leaving the library, a woman approached her. She was unassuming, dressed in practical, unremarkable clothes, but her eyes were sharp, intelligent, missing nothing. "Nightingale?" the woman asked, her voice low and calm. Alara's heart leaped. "Ms. Vance." Ismene Vance nodded. "Let's take a walk." They walked through the bustling city streets, two anonymous figures in the urban throng, but their conversation was anything but ordinary. Alara, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, laid out the entire story, the suppressed reports, the seismic risks, the corporate deception. Vance listened intently, asking pointed, insightful questions, her expression growing grimmer with each revelation. When Alara finally handed over the flash drive, Vance took it with a grim nod. "This is extensive," Vance said, tucking the drive securely into her bag. "And deeply disturbing. If what you're saying is verifiable, Ms. Mensah, and I will verify every last detail, then Sterling and Thorne has a great deal to answer for." "I understand the risks involved," Alara said. "For both of us." Vance met her gaze, a flicker of admiration in her sharp eyes. "Courage takes many forms, Ms. Mensah. Whistleblowing against a corporation like Sterling and Thorne takes a particular brand. I'll be in touch. And in the meantime, be very, very careful." The next few weeks were a blur of anxiety and anticipation. Alara continued her work at Sterling and Thorne, maintaining a facade of normalcy, while every unexpected summons, every closed-door meeting, sent a jolt of fear through her. She knew Sterling and Albright were watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. Then, one Monday morning, it happened. Ismene Vance's exposé on the Horizon Initiative hit the front page of a major national newspaper and simultaneously a leading online investigative journal. The headline was explosive. "Sterling's Gamble. Corporate giant ignored catastrophic risks in pursuit of Delta Gold." The article was meticulously researched, citing the Nightingale reports, quoting anonymous internal sources. Alara knew Davies must have also spoken to Vance, and laying bare the entire sordid tale of deception and greed. The fallout was immediate and seismic. Sterling and Thorne's stock plummeted. Regulatory bodies, spurred by the public outcry, announced immediate investigations. Environmental groups, armed with Vance's evidence, filed lawsuits. The company, which had prided itself on its carefully cultivated image of corporate responsibility, was suddenly mired in a scandal of epic proportions. Alastair Sterling, the visionary CEO, was now facing a firestorm. And Alara Mensah, the quiet junior analyst, had just thrown a very large stone into a very still, very corrupt pond. The corporate headquarters of Sterling and Thorne became a fortress under siege. Reporters swarmed the entrance, their cameras flashing, their questions shouted like accusations. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with panic and recrimination. Meetings were held behind closed doors, voices raised in anger and fear. Alara walked through the corridors, a strange calm settling over her. She was no longer an invisible junior analyst. She knew, the eye of the storm. Ms. Albright passed her in the hallway, her face a mask of fury, her usually immaculate composure shattered. She didn't speak, but her eyes conveyed a venomous promise of retribution. Alara met her gaze steadily, then continued on her way. Later that day, she was summoned to Alistair Sterling's office. Not the boardroom this time, but his private sanctum, a vast, opulent space filled with expensive art and commanding views of the city, now tainted by the scandal he had wrought. Sterling looked older, his face drawn and pale, the charismatic charm replaced by a raw, unvarnished anger. He didn't offer her a seat. "You," he said, his voice a low snarl. "You did this." Alara stood before him, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. "I presented the truth, Mr. Sterling." Ms. Vance reported it. "The truth." Sterling laughed, a harsh, broken sound. "You've destroyed years of work, jeopardized the livelihoods of thousands of employees, tarnished a reputation built over decades. All for what? Some misplaced idealism? Some naive belief in what? Corporate sainthood. "I believe in accountability, Mr. Sterling," Alara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I believe that a company, no matter how powerful, has a responsibility not to cause harm, not to deceive, not to prioritize profit over human lives and the environment." Responsibility? Sterling slammed his fist on his polished desk. "Our responsibility is to our shareholders, to growth, to progress. You wouldn't understand. You, with your small-minded, sentimental notions." He paced the room like a caged animal, his rage barely contained. "Do you have any idea what you've done to me? To this company?" "I think, sir," Alara said, "that the company, under your leadership, did this to itself. The risks were known. The warnings were ignored. The deception was deliberate." Sterling stopped pacing. He stared at her, his eyes blazing. For a moment, Alara thought he might strike her. But then, something in his expression seemed to crumple, a flicker of defeat, or perhaps just the dawning realization of the enormity of his downfall. "They're calling for my resignation," he said, his voice suddenly flat, devoid of its earlier fury. "The board, the investors, even some of my oldest allies." He looked out the window at the city that had once seemed to lie at his feet. "My legacy ruined." Alara felt a pang of something that was not pity, but perhaps a solemn understanding of the human capacity for self-destruction. "Legacies are not built on deceit, Mr. Sterling," she said softly. He turned back to her, his face a mask of bitterness. "And what of your legacy, Ms. Mensah? The righteous whistleblower? Do you think they'll build statues to you? You'll be a pariah in this industry. No one will touch you." "Perhaps," Alara said, "but I'll be able to live with myself. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Sterling sank into his large leather chair, suddenly looking like a very old, very tired man. "Get out," he said, his voice a weary whisper. "Get out of my office. Get out of my company." Alara nodded. She had expected this. She turned and walked towards the door. As she reached it, she paused. "Mr. Sterling," she said, looking back at him, "the people of the Saramonga Delta, they deserve justice. I hope, for your sake, and for the sake of this company's soul, that they receive it." Then she walked out, leaving Alistair Sterling alone with the ruins of his empire. As she cleared out her small cubicle, packing her few belongings into a cardboard box, she felt a sense of lightness, of liberation. She had lost her job, yes. Her future in the corporate world was uncertain, likely non-existent. But she had spoken truth to power. She had made a difference. Arthur Davies was waiting for her by the elevators. He had been reinstated, she'd heard after Sterling's imminent departure was announced. He smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile. "Well done, Ms. Mensah," he said, extending his hand. "Well done indeed." "I couldn't have done it without you, Mr. Davies," Alara said, shaking his hand. "You took a great risk." "Some risks are worth taking," Davies replied, "and some truths are worth fighting for." "What will you do now?" Alara looked out the window at the vast, sprawling city. "I don't know," she admitted. "But for the first time in a long time, I feel hopeful." The future was uncertain, but it was hers to shape. She had found her voice, and she knew, with a quiet certainty, that she would continue to use it, to speak for those who could not, to fight for a world where integrity mattered more than profit, where conscience was not a liability, but a strength. The elevator doors opened, and she stepped inside, ready to face whatever came next. The months that followed were a period of quiet rebuilding for Alara. The corporate world, as Sterling had predicted, largely shunned her. The whistleblower tag, while lauded in some circles, was a mark of Cain in others. Job interviews were polite but brief, opportunities evaporating like morning mist. Yet, she felt no regret. The weight that had lifted from her shoulders with the exposure of the Horizon Initiative's deceit was a freedom more valuable than any salary. Arthur Davies kept in touch, providing quiet encouragement and occasional leads for consultancy work with smaller, more ethically minded organizations. He had become a mentor, a friend, their unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of corporate battle. He told her that Sterling and Thorne, under new, more cautious leadership, had completely overhauled the Horizon Initiative. The Saramonga Delta project, in its original form, was dead. The new plans involved genuine community consultation, rigorous environmental safeguards, and a transparency that had been unthinkable under Sterling's reign. It wasn't perfect, Davies admitted, but it was a start, a testament to the change one person's courage could ignite. Alara found herself drawn to grassroots environmental and social justice movements. She volunteered her analytical skills, helping them decipher complex corporate documents, identify legal loopholes, and build evidence-based campaigns. Her small apartment, once a war room against Sterling and Thorne, now became a hub for a different kind of fight, one fueled by passion and a shared commitment to a more equitable world. She learned that courage wasn't a single act of defiance, but a sustained practice, a daily choice to speak up, to act, even when it was difficult, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The smallest light can pierce the deepest darkness, child. Never be afraid to let yours shine." One crisp autumn afternoon, a year after the scandal broke, Alara received an unexpected invitation. It was from a newly formed independent oversight committee, tasked with monitoring corporate ethics and environmental compliance. They were looking for someone with her unique blend of analytical rigor and unshakable integrity to join their advisory board. It wasn't a high-paying, prestigious corporate position. It was something far more meaningful. As she stood before the committee, a diverse group of academics, activists, and reformed corporate executives, she felt a sense of quiet triumph. She spoke not of her past battles, but of her hopes for the future, of the need for systemic change, for corporations to be held accountable not just for their profits, but for their impact on the world. Later that day, walking through a park, the fallen leaves crunching under her feet, Alara thought of the Saramonga Delta. She had never been there, but she felt a deep connection to its people, to its fragile beauty. She knew the fight for its preservation was far from over, but a crucial battle had been won. She received a letter, forwarded by Ismini Vance, from a community leader in the Delta. It was written in halting English, but its message was clear. It spoke of gratitude, of renewed hope, of the woman with the strong voice who had spoken for them when they had no voice of their own. Enclosed was a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a symbol of freedom and resilience. Alara held the bird in her hand, its smooth, worn with a tangible reminder of the interconnectedness of their struggles, of the power of solidarity. She was no longer alone, no longer an invisible cog in a corporate machine. She was Alara Mensah, a woman who had found her purpose, her voice, her strength. The city lights still twinkled in the distance, a million tiny ambitions. But now, her own light shone among them, steady and clear, a beacon of hope in a world that so desperately needed it. The journey had been arduous, the cost high, but she had emerged not just intact, but transformed. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that this was only the beginning. The contract had been a trap, yes, but in dismantling it, she had liberated more than just a distant delta. She had liberated herself. The advisory board position proved to be more demanding and more rewarding than Alara could have imagined. It wasn't a place of power in the traditional sense, but one of influence, of shaping policy, of holding corporations to a higher standard. She worked alongside individuals who, like Arthur Davies, had grown weary of the prevailing cynicism and were dedicated to forging a new path. Her days were filled with research, with drafting ethical guidelines, with tense but respectful negotiations with corporate representatives. She learned the art of quiet persistence, of finding common ground without compromising her principles. The work was often frustrating, progress incremental, but every small victory, a strengthened environmental regulation, a more equitable community benefit agreement, felt like a monumental achievement. She still lived in her small apartment, the city's hum a constant backdrop to her life. But it no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a vantage point, a place from which she could observe, analyze, and act. She often thought of Alistair Sterling, whose fall from grace had been as swift as it was spectacular. He had faded into obscurity, his name a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms. Ms. Albright, too, had quietly exited Sterling and Thorne, her ambition finally colliding with a reality she couldn't spin. Alara felt no satisfaction in their downfall, only a somber recognition of the destructive power of unchecked greed. Her focus was on building, not destroying, on fostering a culture of accountability, of responsibility, of long-term vision. She received occasional updates from Miss Meanie Vance, who continued her fearless investigative journalism, unearthing other corporate transgressions, shining a light into other dark corners. They had formed a bond of mutual respect, two women from different worlds united by a shared commitment to truth. One spring morning, Alara found a small, unmarked envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a pressed wildflower, its delicate petals of vibrant blue, and a single, handwritten sentence: "The Delta remembers." The birds sing your name. There was no signature, but Alara knew it was from the community she had fought for, a silent acknowledgement that her actions had had a lasting impact, far beyond the confines of corporate boardrooms and newspaper headlines. She placed the wildflower in the carved wooden bird, a small, perfect symbol of the connection between her work and the lives it touched. That evening, Arthur Davies invited her for a quiet dinner. He was fully retired now, but his mind remained sharp, his passion for sustainability undiminished. They spoke of the challenges ahead, of the ongoing fight for a more just and equitable world. "You've made a real difference, Alara," Davies said, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners. "More than you know. You stood up when it was easier to stay silent. That takes a rare kind of courage." Alara smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "I had good teachers," she said, thinking of her grandmother, of Davies himself. "And I learned that some contracts, the ones we make with our conscience, are non-negotiable." As she walked home through the lamplit streets, the city felt different. It was no longer a symbol of oppressive power, but a place of possibility, a landscape of interconnected lives, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own capacity for courage. She was a part of that landscape now. Her voice, once a whisper, now a clear, steady note in the complex symphony of the urban night. The trap had been sprung, the CEO's smile had faded, but Alara Mintz's journey was just beginning. And she faced it with her head held high, her heart full, her spirit unbroken. The years that followed were not without their struggles. The fight for corporate accountability was a relentless one, an ongoing battle against deeply entrenched systems of power and profit. There were setbacks, disappointments, moments when the sheer scale of the challenge felt overwhelming. But Alara never wavered. The quiet tenacity that had defined her from the beginning only deepened, tempered by experience, sharpened by each new confrontation. She became a respected voice in her field, her opinions sought by policymakers, her presence a source of unease for corporations that prioritize short-term gains over long-term responsibility. She never sought the spotlight, preferring to work behind the scenes, her meticulous research and irrefutable data her most potent weapons. The carved wooden bird from the Saramonga Delta always sat on her desk, a silent reminder of why she did what she did, of the lives that hung in the balance. Arthur Davies remained a steadfast friend and mentor, his wisdom a guiding light. They would meet regularly, sharing insights, frustrations, and the small, hard-won victories that kept them going. Ismene Vance, too, continued to be a crucial ally, her investigative journalism often providing the public pressure needed to force change where institutional channels failed. Alara learned that true strength wasn't about being fearless, but about acting despite fear. It was about showing up day after day and doing the work, even when it felt like pushing a boulder uphill. It was about nurturing hope, not as a passive wish, but as an active, resilient force. She never married, never had children of her own in the traditional sense. Her family became the network of activists, researchers, and ethical leaders she worked alongside, a community bound by shared values and a common purpose. Her life was her work, and her work was her passion. One day, years later, she was invited to speak at a major international conference on sustainable development. As she stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces, CEOs, government officials, NGO representatives, young activists eager to make their mark, she thought back to that terrified junior analyst on the 47th floor of Sterling and Thorne. She thought of the crushing weight of that deceptive contract, of Alistair Sterling's dismissive smile. So much had changed since then. She had changed. The world, slowly, painstakingly, was changing too. In her speech, she didn't recount her own battles. Instead, she spoke of the people of the Saramonga Delta, of their resilience, their deep connection to their land. She spoke of the responsibility that came with power, of the moral imperative to protect the vulnerable, to safeguard the planet for future generations. Her voice was calm, measured, but her words carried the undeniable weight of conviction, of lived experience. Afterwards, a young woman approached her, her eyes shining with admiration. "Ms. Mensah," she said, "your story, it's an inspiration. You showed us that one person can make a difference." Alara smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached her eyes. "We all can," she replied. "It just takes courage, persistence, and a willingness to speak truth to power, even when your voice trembles." As she left the conference hall, the setting sun casting long shadows across the city, she felt a profound sense of peace. The path had been difficult, fraught with peril, but she had walked it with integrity. The contract had been a trap, designed to ensnare, to exploit, to silence. But in exposing it, in fighting against it, Alara Mensah had not only averted a disaster, she had found her calling, her purpose, her enduring strength. And the CEO's smile, once a symbol of arrogant power, was now just a faded memory, a testament to the enduring truth that even the most formidable facades can crumble in the face of unwavering courage and the relentless pursuit of justice. Her own smile, however, was real, and it was just beginning.